Good evening. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the William G. McGowan Theater this evening. And a special welcome to those who are watching on YouTube for tonight's discussion about Harriet Tubman, a woman of courage and vision. And an even warmer welcome to those of you who are watching us on C-SPAN. We're pleased to present this program in partnership with the National Park Service in celebration of the upcoming grand opening of the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad State Park in Church Creek, Maryland. Before we get to tonight's program, I'd like to tell you about two upcoming programs that will take place in this theater. On Thursday, March 2nd at 7 p.m., a program titled The Glass Ceiling, Broken or Cracked will present a bipartisan group of former Congresswomen to discuss their paths to public service, the challenges they faced, and the obstacles women still need to overcome. Our partner for this discussion is the U.S. Association of Former Members of Congress. And next Wednesday, March 8th at noon, author Scott Miller will be here to discuss and sign his new book, Agent 110, An American Spy Master in the German Resistance in World War II. To learn more about these and all of our public programs and exhibits, consult our monthly calendar of events. There are copies in the lobby as well as sign-up sheets where you can receive it by regular mail or email, and you'll also find brochures about other National Archives activities. And another way to get more involved with the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports all of our education and outreach activities. There are applications for membership also in the lobby. And a little known secret that I keep divulging, no one has ever been turned down for membership in the National Archives Foundation. During the Civil War, an escaped slave, Underground Railroad conductor, and abolitionist, Harriet Tubman Davis served the Union side as a scout, nurse, cook, and spy. For all she endured and accomplished, her life is legendary. Legendary, but not legend, for the evidence of her deeds resides in various archives and manuscript collections, and here at the National Archives. In 1863, Tubman makes an appearance as a witness in a court-martial proceeding. At the time, she was working as a nurse at a contraband camp in South Carolina, and the court transcript allows us to hear her in her own words. After the war, she received a pension as the widow of a Union veteran, Nelson Davis, who had served as a private in the 8th United States Colored Infantry. Years after he died, Tubman petitioned Congress for additional benefits for her own services, outlined in her affidavit as nurse and cook in hospitals and as commander of several men, 8 or 9, as scouts during the late war. Congress received numerous documents and letters supporting Tubman's claim, and they, along with her affidavit, are here in the records of the United States House of Representatives. In 1899, Congress passed and the President signed legislation that authorized an increase of Tubman's pension to $20 a month for her service as a nurse. Tonight, a distinguished panel will examine the life and legacy of Harriet Tubman and the ongoing preservation efforts of her Maryland birthplace. We'll begin with a presentation from Marcy Wolf-Ross, Assistant Director for Tourism Development at the Maryland Office of Tourism Development in Baltimore, Maryland. Ms. Ross is filling in for Robert T. Parker, listed in your program, but unfortunately unable to be with us tonight. Then Dr. Ida Jones, University Archivist at Morgan State University, will lead the discussion. Dr. Jones is the University Archivist at Morgan State. Her scholarship is evident in numerous publications and speaking engagements, as well as radio and television appearances. She is the author of 3 books, all biographies of pivotal figures in African American history, whose lives in Washington, D.C. have been lesser known. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Marcy Wolf-Ross, Dr. Ida Jones, and the panel to the stage.
Good evening. Again, I am Marcy Ross, and I work for the great state of Maryland in the Maryland Office of Tourism Development, and I'm thrilled to be here tonight to invite all of you to visit us in Maryland and to discover for yourselves why Maryland is the most powerful Underground Railroad storytelling destination on the planet. I'm going to take you through that invitation by sharing some of the progress we've made over the last 20 years and throughout the Maryland Underground Railroad Initiative. That initiative is an effort that is a true collaboration. It's a collaboration among the public sector and the private sector, government, nonprofit, for-profit, and really a statewide representation of a very passionate constituency who has come to the state of Maryland and said, will you please help us get this important story told and then share it with the world. So I'd like to share with you today where we are with some of the projects as part of our initiative. First and foremost, I'd like to share with you information about the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Historical Park. As you can see here, it was established by President Obama on March 25th. Coincidentally, that's Maryland Day, through an executive order after many, many, many years of work in order to get that park established. It was actually the monument first, and then shortly thereafter, the National Historical Park. The mission, of course, is to protect landscapes and places where that were important to Tubman's life, and as an enslaved child, young woman, and freedom seeker in Dorchester County. And then in order to actually have a national park, the NPS had to acquire land in that landscape where she was from. This map here just gives you some information about the boundaries of the National Historical Park. This entire landscape was determined by the National Park Service to be one of the most well-preserved and authentic agrarian landscapes in the country. And as you drive through there and you visit, you will see that not much has changed since Harriet's time. As I mentioned earlier, none of this would have been possible had it not been for wonderful partnerships, collaboration, and certainly passion, whether it's the image you see here on the left, which is the Harriet Tubman Museum and home to the Harriet Tubman Organization, which has really been the flag bearer for getting Tubman and Underground Railroad stories told on the Eastern Shore for many, many years, to some of the other attractions like the Bucktown Village Store, the Dorchester County Visitor Center, which welcomes people from all over the world, and others. So first, there was this designation as a monument. There's actually no statue or monument per se. It was really a mechanism to help us get National Park Service support to help get this important story told. We are in the process of putting the final touches on a brand new Underground Railroad Visitor Center, which is a cooperative endeavor between the Maryland Park Service and the National Park Service. Also, what has come to Maryland with that legislation that established the national park is Maryland is now home to the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom program. The Network to Freedom program is a wonderful opportunity for anybody who would care to get involved in Underground Railroad research and help share those stories through designations of sites, programs, and facilities. It just so happens that right now, Maryland has more Network to Freedom program members than any other state in the nation. So just because the park is established doesn't mean that the work is over. Beyond getting it established, they're working on what's known as a foundation document, as a planning document to move the park forward and engage the community. They're also looking at the natural resources and the cultural landscape in the area with the goal of eventually acquiring more properties related to Tubman. And they're going to take a look at a visitor study so they can make sure that the information we're providing is good for visitors. I'm going to just skip over these next two slides because a colleague of mine is going to go ahead and touch base on those in a minute. But what you see here is you see an image of what the visitor center looks like from the southwestern side. Those buildings have a shape and a purpose, and you're going to hear a little bit more about that when Chris, our architect, comes up and speaks about the design of the park. This is another view looking from the south to the north and into the front door and plaza of the visitor center. Just a back view, it's multi-level, it's about 15,000 square feet, and what you see in the picture of the beams are beams that have been reused from barns that have been taken down, so that helped get the center structure its LEED certification. The park site itself, which is 17.44 acres, has an outdoor pavilion for gatherings of up to like 150. There's a fireplace out there and lots of picnic tables. To give you a taste of the interior, I'm going to run this fly-through, as we call it. There's no sound, so you have to put up with me walking you or flying you through this video. So this rendering would be as if you are walking in the front door and the lobby. And yes, it mostly focuses on Tubman and the Underground Railroad in Maryland, but because it's the home of the Network to Freedom, we have Network to Freedom exhibits, and we also have orientation exhibits to the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad Byway, which was designated one of the best driving tours in the nation in 2008. There's a gift shop, but as you can see here, as a visitor, you are brought figuratively back in time through this gateway entrance and what we call affectionately the egg. And this is a very transformative space. It's one that will be filled with images and sound, and the goal is to have all of you leave your modern world behind and enter into Tubman's. So there are really 3, maybe 4 specific focuses of the exhibits. What you see here in front of you is you see Tubman's story, early life, and we talk about what it was like to be enslaved in Maryland, what enslavement meant in Maryland, and what it must have been like for Tubman as a little girl to have to live through what it is that she lived through. And if you think about Tubman, you know, she was born African. She was born as a woman, a female. She was born without any opportunity to have education. And later on in her life, she was also disabled. So when you think about that at the time and how remarkable she was, it sets a great stage for how you can move through the rest of the inside of the park and the exhibits. We move on to part of the story more known as the journey and her rescues, the times that she came back, her self-liberation, and her coming back for family. She came back to get her parents and her siblings, others. But in her heart, her ultimate goal at the end was to come back and bring her sister Rachel and her children to safety. It's sad to say that Tubman never got to realize that part of her mission to free people, because Rachel was sold south and was never heard from or seen again. So toward the end, and the third part of the exhibits is what we call the journey. And we talk more about the greater context of Tubman, what she was faced in the Civil War, later in life, her work as a humanitarian, and her life in New York. And then we have here, we're moving down toward what's known as the Legacy Gallery. We have beautiful stained glass images, and it's a really wonderful place for contemplation and just a rest, because if you've ever been into a storytelling facility like this, sometimes the information you find can be overwhelming. We're cruising right by the theater here on the right, and we will take our leave of the interior of the visitor center. So, as I mentioned, this is really an invitation, and we would very much like for all of you to join us on Maryland's Eastern Shore on March 11th and 12th for the grand opening of the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad Visitor Center. There's a wonderful programming that's going to be there. Dr. Kate Clifford Larson, who wrote Bound for the Promised Land, will be there giving some instruction. Our esteemed colleague Chris will be there talking about the View North, as well as some other wonderful programming, not just for adults, but for the whole family. And last, I would like to show you the landscape beyond the Tubman Visitor Center. As I mentioned earlier, Maryland is home to the beginning of the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad byway. In Maryland, it's 125 miles of driving that takes you to the places where Tubman actually was born, lived, sought her freedom, and came back to rescue others. I will say that there's also some fun to have along the way, in addition to learning all of this great history. So here we go. And there should be some audio running here. Now, if that isn't an invitation, I don't know what is. So thank you very much for allowing me to share your evening, and I promise you, if you travel to Maryland, it will be transformative. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Honorable David Fierro, the Archivist of the United States, for your warm introduction and the welcome to your house. I love this space at the McGowan. It's a very warm and intimate theater, yet with a respectable sense of plush seats. I want to also thank Tom Nastick, our logistics guy, behind and on deck on everything. And I'd like to welcome you to the audience for coming out tonight in the midst of the rain, which has some level of symbolism as libation and catharsis for our discussion on Harriet Tubman, a woman of courage and vision. And we had family, faith, and community also in our other edition we had done in Maryland. Nevertheless, I'm here to be your moderator and to introduce our panel. We have a very distinguished panel that I would like to introduce to you, and then I would like to just give you some talking points that we're going to be discussing, and hopefully you have some conversation to join with us in the middle. From the far left, your left, is Marcy Ross Wolf. Did I get that right this time, Marcy?
That's all good.
Marcy Wolf Ross. She serves as the Assistant Director of the Tourism Development at the Maryland Office of Tourism Development. She leads the program responsible for the management of the state's customer contact centers, the development of new regional and statewide travel products, and the County Cooperative Grants Program, which annually provides matching grants, those in Maryland, listen, matching grants, to the state's 23 counties in Baltimore City and Ocean City. She represents the MOTD on the Capital Region U.S. Board of Directors, the Maryland Heritage Area Authority, and numerous other tourism-related entities. She assisted in identifying sites capable of receiving $15 million in grants awarded to help develop multiple historic tourist destinations throughout the state of Maryland, including, as you heard, the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad bypass. For her work in the field of heritage tourism, she's been honored by a number of organizations, including the Maryland Association of Destination Marketing Organizations, the White House Conference on Cooperative Conservation, and the African American Tourism Council of Maryland. It was under her leadership that Maryland was the first in the nation to produce the statewide National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom Guide. To her left is Dr. Cheryl LaRoche. She is an archaeologist and assistant research professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Maryland, College Park. She has researched and mapped African American history and Underground Railroad sites for the past 17 years. Her work has led to the call for a new field of study, African American critical geography. She served as the lead author and the cultural landscape consultant for the 2009 Harriet Tubman Special Resource Study, Environmental Assessment. She also consulted for the Byway Project and participated in the Tubman National Monument Scholars Roundtable. Dr. LaRoche served as the project historian for the Cultural Expressions exhibition for the Smithsonian's new Museum on African American History and Culture. The Society of Historical Archaeology awarded Dr. LaRoche the John L. Cotter Award for her exemplary work in bringing a multiple disciplinary approach to the study of African American archaeology. Her first book, Free Communities and the Underground Railroad, A Geography of Resistance, shameless plug, I just got my copy. I encourage all of you to get yours to follow her work, and we celebrate her. To her left is Chris Elcock. He served as the project manager for the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad Visitor Center. He is a senior associate with the GWWO Incorporated Architects, a nationally recognized Baltimore-based firm specializing in the design of visitor and interpretive centers. Chris was responsible for coordinating all aspects of the project concept design and construction for a team, in addition to architects, engineers, landscape architects, marketing consultants, videographers, and exhibit designers. So it's tantalizing on all fronts. Dedicated to this project since 2008, Chris's immense passion for this project, one that is sure to be a standout of his career, helped to drive the new Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad Visitor Center. And when you hear him talk about it, you will really be enveloped by what his concept was, to the successful completion. Within 20 years of experience, he currently leads a team of 12 architects on projects that focus on interpretation, education, and the performing arts. And the GWWO Architects Incorporated are nationally recognized specialists in designing cultural and educational facilities within historically, culturally, or environmentally sensitive contexts. Since their founding, the Baltimore-based firm has been involved in the design of over 50 visitor centers, museums, and interpretive facilities, among which are the George Washington Mount Vernon Ford Orientation Center, and in Baltimore, once again, the Fort McHenry National Monument and Historic Shrine Visitor Education Center. To his left is the illustrious colleague and friend of mine, the Elizabeth Clark Lewis. Dr. Elizabeth Clark Lewis is an award-winning historian of the United States and the founding director of the Public History Program at Howard University. She has taught courses on African American women, women in the United States, African American history, history of the District of Columbia, and the history of African Americans in Pennsylvania. As the director of the Public History Program, she has offered courses in museums and archives, oral history, historic preservation, and a seminar in field studies. In conjunction, she has taught students about genealogical research and family genealogy and courses on related themes. She has published books and articles on various subjects, among which is First Freed, Emancipation in the District of Columbia, and her award-winning book, Living In, Living Out, African American Domestics in Washington, D.C. If I had it, I would hold it up, but you can definitely look for that, and I'll repeat it. Living In, Living Out, great book on domestic workers. She has written over a dozen articles on women, race, household workers, and related subjects, which have appeared in a number of professional journals. She served as the project director and producer of a PBS documentary, which was an outgrowth of Living In, called Freedom Bags. It's an award-winning film, won the Oscar Michaud Award, and she has been supported by numerous research grants from the National Park Service and the National Endowment for the Arts and the DC Humanities Council. So before I start with my panelists, I have another book I have to share as a fellow archivist and educator. And this is by Milton Surnett. And it's called Harriet Tubman, Myth, Memory, and History. It's a very good synopsis for those of us who are academics or lay academics or just simply interested in knowing how do you write history. Historians need archives. Here at the National Archives are voluminous records on the Civil War. I know we worked on the Civil War Soldiers and Sailors program, and they have jackets on that. But you really have to delve into the original resource, the primary sources that we all know, History 101. For persons such as Harriet Tubman and her contemporaries, they were not allowed to leave written resources. They were not allowed to learn to read. So we don't call them illiterate. We call them unliterate or non-literate people because they were not given the capacity to exercise that potential. So when we look at someone like that, how do they document themselves? How do they explain themselves? We have to use other sources and other means with which to do so. And in this, Surnett goes through the academic challenge on trying to capture that story, and Dr. LaRoche has done an excellent job of being able to reconvene and re-meet with those things that we're very much pleased to see now that we can use the ecology, the landscape, along with the physical structures and the visual history to recreate the world in which Harriet Tubman lived. Those of you who were outside standing in the rain with me, it was very cathartic and almost somewhat mystical as libation being poured from heaven by our ancestors. She was very much an African person. Her parents were enslaved, she was enslaved, but there was a very strong Africanism in the culture that was in these rural parts of America. So it's not foreign to her to understand herself in terms of using constellations and stars, to use visions and dreams, to use spiritual entities with which to help guide her north. She had no fear of being recaptured, and she made multiple trips back. So when we look at Harriet Tubman, we should see her as a prism, refracting the light of the enslaved person, the enslaved woman, the person desiring to be free, the person who sees herself as an individual, but also part of a community, and representing us as Americans. She was an American citizen, although a proto-American citizen, because it wasn't written in until about the 14th Amendment. But nevertheless, we celebrate her as a hero, a courageous person, and someone that we can see as a prism through which we can refract light. Of course, for Morgan State, I have to bring in Morgan State. They opened a dorm in the 1940s called the Harriet Tubman Dorm for our female students. And on commemoration of that dorm, a student spoke, and she wrote, "Morgan State College is therefore happy to thus honor her, and the women are proud to reside in the building made sacred by the name of this heroic character, whose example should be an inspiration, not only to the women of the school and the state of Maryland, but to all women seeking to live fully and to render service worthy of their day and generation." So that's who she means to me, and I'm going to ask our panelists to discuss in about 3 to 5 minutes how they touch Harriet Tubman and how they would want you to join them in exploring her life. So thank you. We'll get ready for questions and answers once we're finished. Thank you. Who wants to go first? Should Chris, you want to go first?
Sure.
Did you need the slides? Or are you?
Yeah,
Okay.
I'll get up in a second. So, as an architect, a project like this is just an extraordinary honor, and for my life's work and for the work of the firm, we do what we call story-based design, and we love projects where there's stories to be told, and then one day the opportunity to work on something like this happens, and just an extraordinary honor. The design for a project like this is something where we don't start with a pen, we start with our ears, and for us, when the state first advertised that they were looking for the architects to submit qualifications to do this project, we came down and to see the site, and it was really interesting. It was just this 17 acres of an abandoned farmland and protected woodlands to the north. We knew that to the north of the site was property that was owned by the Fisheries and Wildlife, but just south of that, for 17 acres, just flat nothing. And most people, overheard most people talking about the fact that, well, gosh, there's nothing here. Is this just a blank canvas? And for us, everything was there. Everything was already there for us. You had an empty site, and you had to direct north these woods, and it made us think, why wouldn't anybody at any given time just get up and leave? What held us back? So many months of hard work and later we settled on this concept, and I hope everybody can see it. I'm going to try to see if, yes, it will work. So this, we actually developed 4 concepts, but this one is the one that was chosen. It's called the view north. And so north is up. So these are the woods that were there that we wanted to exploit. And everything about this, we worked really closely as architects with the landscape architects and the exhibit designers, because we felt that it all had to come together. And so essentially what we do is we start you at the southernmost point of the site, and then we take you, even while you're in your vehicle, on a journey north. And so this is sort of your first orienting principle. You realize then that the buildings, there are 2 buildings that splay open like this. And so you can drop off if necessary, or if not, you can take the shortcut loop and park. But then even when you leave your cars, you're again traveling north, and then you slip over in this direction towards the interpretive center. The entire site is made up of, you see several different tones of green here on this site, on these 17 acres, and it's deliberate, because what we wanted to do was make sure that we reinforced this view north. And we do that in the landscape, with the landscape design, by having a series of grasses at different heights. And what we're doing here is exploring different notions of concealment. Again, this is the Underground Railroad story. And so this area is the lawn, which is kept at what you would consider the traditional height that you would have grass, 3-4 inches. And then on either side, then we begin to change that height to knee high and then waist high. And so as you stand here, even as when you first come to visit the site, you may see people walking across, and they're going to be crossing in the memorial garden at various levels of exposure. You're going to be in the field at the same time that we saw this site back in 2008, and you're going to be able to look to the north. But other times, you're going to be amongst trees and amongst grasses at different heights. And at certain intervals, I will say, you'll notice that you have to make a decision. You have to make a decision whether you're going to turn here or turn here. Ultimately, we put you back on, we deliver you back safely to where you started. But you have this opportunity to make these choices, and so you have this opportunity to be exposed, fully exposed, partially exposed, completely concealed. And it gives you an opportunity to, we hope, even when you're outside, to think about those decisions and think about that people had to make these decisions, and that it was not a convenient thing just to head north. Who could you trust? Who should you trust? And who may report on you? The visitor center itself is, we actually split the building into 2. I mean, they wanted a building. So the business of running the park is on this side, and this is sort of the public side. And so this essentially is this building is really a non-building, because the Park Service, the National Park Service and the Maryland Park Service are located here. And so this is essentially just a wall to frame that view north for the visitor. And then, because it's a park and there are some recreational aspects, then this is the area where we decouple sort of the more serious aspect for the park to the areas of recreation. I'll go forward a little bit and explain to you again. This is another, because this story was so rich with possibilities and rich with information, we wanted again to incorporate as much of that as we could, even with how you would circulate this building. So this is just a blow up of the exhibit building, and many of us understand the notion and understand that, okay, you travel north towards freedom. What was interesting with Tubman's story was that she came back, and we can prove that she came back 13 times. We have official documentation for 13 returns. And so you come here into the lobby, you start, and you think that you're just going to head north, and the building actually goes from darker to lighter. There's more light at the top here than it is when you start to experience the exhibits. But again, we don't just send you on a northbound mission. You're going to get pulled across, and we understand that the escapes were never, if the escapes were linear, you could be caught much easier. And so you go through this story, and you learn all about the Underground Railroad and from the Maryland context. And then what do? We take you as she did. We return you back. You come back more enlightened and ready to go again. And so those are just some of the examples that where we talk about using the story and using the person and using the information that we learned to guide us with the architecture. We are avid readers. Architects are readers as well, and so we spent a lot of time combing through Bound for the Promised Land that was mentioned before by Kate Larson. But we also spent time with another book, James McBride's Song Yet Sung. That was fictional, but he came to the Eastern Shore. He came for a day, changed his plans, and spent 4 more days on the byways, and then produced this book. And it's a fictional story of this Tubman-like character who had these premonitions. And so the landscape is just so incredibly transportive that we were able to hopefully take all of that inspiration and embed it within the project. I think I'll stop there and give everybody else a chance to talk.
Anyone else want to go? Anyone else? Anyone else?
Okay.
Thank you all for coming out this evening and this wet, soggy day. We really appreciate you being here. I'm going to talk to you about something a little different. I would expect that most of you already know the facts of Tubman's life. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the trips or talking about what she did. I want to talk to you and weave 3 different threads together. I've been living with Harriet Tubman for such a long time that I've been thinking about her in more abstract ways, and that's what I want to say to you tonight. I want you to understand a different way of thinking about this woman and thinking about her history. And I want us to think about what she means for the modern era. You know, my students are always like, look, professor, how can I use it? Why are you telling me this? I mean, history has to be useful. That's the way our students think about it. And I want to leave you with a useful history of Harriet Tubman. Why is she relevant right now? I'm going to also put her life in the larger context of Black history. Why is it important to talk about her in the context as we wrap up Black History Month? I'm going to talk about that a little bit as well. So what does she mean for the modern era? Why should we care besides calling her a hero? What does that actually mean? We know that Tubman's life exemplified moral courage, that the things that she did took something beyond what ordinary people have. Most of us may have thought about doing heroic things, but maybe we falter. Not only did she have moral courage, but that is dependent on having fine moral character. These are things that we do not usually apply when we're talking about people held in slavery. Sometimes I'll give a talk and people will look at me and say, you're talking about slaves, right? Yes, I'm talking about human beings who had many of the same kinds of qualities that we look to for people who are exhibiting much greater capacity. And yet Tubman is there doing things that are unbelievable in my mind. And as we think about ourselves, we can draw some examples for ourselves and for our leaders about stepping forward with the same moral courage that Tubman displayed in the face of injustice. When you are faced with difficult decisions, do you have the courage to step forward as she did? These are things that really resonate with me as I think about her. You know, she escaped not once but twice. And the first time she left, her brothers made her return. They lost their courage. We know that courage is fleeting. We know that it can stay with us at one point and leave us the next. Tubman knew that, and she carried a pistol, because when your courage left you, she pulled out that gun and said, if my leadership won't get you there, this gun will. You will not be going back. She understood, however, that we're weak at times. And when we're weak, and when we are perhaps afraid to go forward, she needed something to encourage you to move through. So she knew that she had to build courage when our courage failed us. This is human nature. She knew how to lead when you lost the ability to lead yourself, when you lost your courage and your hope. If her personal assurance couldn't get the job done, then surely that pistol would. And she had a deep faith in God. And often that's been characterized by historians as superstition, that she had all of these. It's been treated very lightly. Harriet Tubman had a personal relationship with God, and anybody who reads her narrative and understands her story knows that she was in direct dialogue with the Creator. And much of what she was able to do was because of her unshakable faith that God had put her here to do something important, and she followed through. She often said that she told God she didn't want to do these things, and God came back time and again and said, no, Harriet, I want you. And so she also followed that mandate and fulfilled. The other piece of her life is around leadership. She is not a person that's going to, if you go to central casting to look for leadership, she's not showing up. She's a woman, she's a black woman in the 19th century. That should rule her out for any form of leadership, considering the history of African Americans in this country. She's barely 5 feet tall. She's unable to read or write. And yet she leads scores of people out of slavery. No one ever catches her. People with far greater resources, far more money, far more opportunity to track her down, never caught her. So you have to have a lot of respect, at least I do, for this woman. On her very first trip, imagine this. She's escaped twice, once when her brother made her come back, her brothers made her come back, and then the second time successfully. Can you imagine that the very next trip, she takes her niece, her husband, a 6-year-old, and an infant out of slavery? And I always say, I don't know about you, but anybody who's ever traveled for more than 15 minutes with a 6-year-old, you know that this has got to be some incredible feat that this woman has done. I think about that all the time. How can you escape with these 6-year-olds and these people? This is on-the-job training for Harriet Tubman. Her leadership shows courage in the face of impossible circumstances. And I want you to understand that just because you're being led doesn't mean you're experiencing leadership. We often confuse the rule of power and might with leadership, but it has nothing to do with either. Tubman showed a courage, moral fiber, and an understanding of how to bring people forward when she had few of the things that we would say are important for leadership. And the last thing I want to talk about is how this history is relevant for Black history. You know, Black history also, like Tubman in some ways, has been treated quite lightly. Sound bites, facts, you know, Black history moments, it's a month, and then we're finished. And yet, if we take that history much more seriously, if we examine the fundamental messages inside of Black history, without all the trappings of power and status or even education that often muddies the water when we're talking about leadership, we understand that Black history has a great, deep, important lesson for all of us to learn. Once we get away from thinking about slaves and minstrelsy and all of the ways in which Black history has been maligned. So all the moral lessons that our society wants to learn that we derive from Greek tragedies or Aesop's fables, they're all available inside Black history. We do not have to go to the Greeks. You know, you talk about rolling a rock up a hill. We have other stories in there that we can think about in terms of Black history. We need to go deeper. We need to apply the higher order thinking as we examine the qualities of her life, her leadership, her moral authority, her endurance, her perseverance, her fortitude, her compassion, her altruism, She's one of the world's great humanitarians. All of these qualities are qualities that are embodied inside of Tubman's life. And I invite you to think about her and to think about Black history with a renewed depth and with a much greater understanding that there's so much that you can derive for your own life from studying this woman's history and from studying Black history. Thank you.
This building is so important for me and a number of others because a number of years ago, I won't say how many, I was very young and we were doing what was considered impossible, African American family history. And because of this building, I was able to chronicle an enslaved little girl who came at age 8, just after the American Revolution. I was able to document her 3 sons, the oldest of which was Peyton, who would have 3 wives and 33 children in total. It was so important that these records were here and that these records literally helped me reframe my own family history and would lead to the creation of the African American Historical and Genealogical Society. As one of its founders, we looked to people like Tubman in the wider world issues, but we also were grounded in our own family stories. Tubman, like the women in my family, 3 generations of which were enslaved, and again, these records here help me document their lives. Tubman was a woman who was direct and serious and has been a national symbol for African American women. People like me grew up hearing about her, passing it on to, I had a lovely goddaughter, Monica Blackston Totten, that I remember her always reading stories like this, down to my own daughter and granddaughter. But Harriet Tubman, like a fellow Marylander, Frederick Douglass, is regarded as a far-reaching leader of enormous and enduring influence. Her long life allowed her to transcend simply being a personality. Her life was one of empowerment, and it has inspired African Americans and others to learn from the world over, what was it like for this woman and others from that day to this? There's subtle analyses about everything that Harriet Tubman touched during her years in Maryland in particular. The National Park Service loves to talk about period of significance. So keeping it in that period of significance, we can understand that Harriet Tubman's story requires a masterful blend of scholarship and public history. Public history being the program that I direct at Howard University, we're comfortable as scholars reading books, but it's important for us to get out and take the history to the wider audience. One of my PhD graduates. This groundbreaking park creates a new way of understanding this wonderful landmark figure and the story of her courageous life. Kelly Smith wrote about the pseudoscience, for example, of the era that focused on African American, on women and weaknesses, and even included African Americans. But more than anything else, Harriet Tubman helps us understand that it was strength that would carry her forward. Frequently, when you teach students, they immediately talk about revenge. Why didn't people strike out and take different options? Harriet Tubman's story helps us understand how she pushed for equality and opportunity rather than revenge. And she made it work during her many, 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 many travels back to take people into freedom and her push for liberation. The tension between property, which she was, and liberty, which she always sought, was always very, very serious. She always went back into Maryland to help people escape, but she was also unwilling to accept this system. She literally indicted this enslavement system and the conduct of its owners. She refused to accept these concocted stories about the happy enslaved person. And what she did was not only in her life reflected, she, at the end of her life, even wrote about it, so that it was clear, the message was lucid, what history really was for her. As I said, one of the things that public historians do is to take this story wider. And Howard University has a grant that goes beyond Harriet Tubman, this individual, and helps us center her in this wider community. And one person I discovered was a man, William Calderhead, who had been an American Revolutionary War soldier. And like every soldier, he received a land grant in lieu of pay. He immediately sold it, and I was reading his obituary, and it was so moving. He immediately sold it. And in spite of his many acts of bravery, he said the most important thing for him to do was to go back to Caroline County, and he lived out his life in Dorchester. What it tells us is that there are many people who, like Tubman, whether free or enslaved, felt it was very important to return to this area. And why did they return? This whole issue of cultural landscapes is so important. I've had the ability to go to the site when it was evolving, and it is so moving because the cultural landscapes help us understand how the environment can influence and shape an individual. A cultural landscape can be associated with a person or an event. It can be thousands of acres or a tiny homestead. It can be grand, small, as I said, a park, a garden, a cemetery, a campus, and much more. Collectively, cultural landscapes are works of art, narratives of culture and expressions of an identity. One of the most important and endearing cultural landscapes are found in North Carolina. They're the box pines of North Carolina. And African Americans not only escaped there for freedom, but after freedom, they worked there removing the tar and the substances from the trees. And one of the things that was unbelievable to me, being a person who evolved from an enslaved person in Virginia, were these V's that they put on all the trees. And as they pulled this sap forward, it created not only an economic base, but it created an important cultural landscape and a natural resource that's so important for us today. Just as we see those marks on the trees, just as I learned the footprints left for me by Peyton Johnson and this little girl, Winnie, we see that Harriet Tubman went over mountains and hills, plains, and most importantly, used the stars to guide herself and her people to freedom. But it wasn't just this one group that she took. It is so wonderful when you're at this site to see how the site helps you understand this journey that each of us take and how each of us move in our own way to freedom, justice, and a new sense of liberty. Thank you very much.
I'd like to ask my co-panelist, Marcy, if you can kind of explain to us how is the area in Dorchester County preparing for us in terms of the national and regional visitorship that will be coming and trafficking through. And I saw pictures of destination sites and some chuckles in the audience in terms of making it kind of light, but we have to make it an enjoyable experience. So can you talk about how on the ground and in the community, Maryland tourism and the parks, state and federal are working to make that happen?
Sure. And just to step back in time a little bit, July of this year, the city of Cambridge, which is really the gateway city to Tubman's homeland and her birthplace, burned. It was a city filled with hate, and it was a city filled with sadness, and it was a very much part of a divided community. And so for literally 50 years later, to have flipped that on its head took work not only by governmental institutions, but it took drive and determination by the people of Dorchester and Caroline counties and all over Maryland's Eastern Shore. So it's a large responsibility to host visitors, visitors that are from close by, from far away, and from across oceans. So we've prepared by some obvious things. We have this wonderful visitor center that's going to open. We have the driving tour, which takes people beyond those walls and puts them in that storytelling landscape in a way that isn't done in many other places. And what I think is the most remarkable of how we've prepared is that we have done some workforce development training. We have run tour guide training programs. We had a class of 25. We worked with our partner institution, the University of Maryland, Eastern Shore. And we had a professor there help write the curriculum. And we offered this training class to Dorchester and Caroline County residents only. Those are the two counties in Maryland that are host and home to the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad byway. We felt it was very important to give the people of Maryland's Eastern Shore the first opportunity to take this type of training because we really wanted to empower them to take the story to the next level. And if they chose to become step-on guides or museum docents or independent storytellers, that they had the opportunity to do that. So not only have we invested in infrastructure of the built kind, we've invested in people who are willing to take the time to learn more and share the story. As we get close to the opening of the visitor center, we've taken the training to the next level. We've actually just launched what we're calling a certified business host program. And any business that will be affected by people coming in to learn more about Tubman, we're asking them to do a few simple things. Watch a video that talks about the importance of hosting visitors from around the world, and in particular on the Eastern Shore. Sometimes it's not so welcoming to people from the outside. So we wanted to make sure that if somebody came and they weren't dressed the way they were perceived to be dressed, or they had an accent, or they got frustrated, believe it or not, with the farm equipment that rolls through that agrarian landscape, that the people of Dorchester and Caroline County had an opportunity to understand that when you invite people from all over the world to come and see what you have to offer, there's an opportunity to tell them stories, and if you choose, grow your businesses or bring them into your museums and help continue on the story. So it's a relatively easy certification to have. So not only do we want the residents and the business people of the Eastern Shore to capitalize on this opportunity, we want to make sure that people that are coming from near and far are welcomed into that community. Because I'll tell you, thinking back 50 years ago, it wasn't always the case.
That's a very good portrait of America in small towns. We have microphones on either side of the aisle, so if people want to start to line up for questions, we can do so. Because I'm glad I can ask the panelists some more questions, but we really want to make this conversational between you as well as us on stage. So I'm glad you to take another round of questions from the panelists, but if anybody has a question they would like to go to either microphone, please make your way there and we'll get ready for questions and answers. So for our second round of questions in terms of the panelists and your classrooms, how do you think that can be for a student to learn, both a domestic and international student? What kind of takeaway should they have in terms of not all college level, but maybe high school, elementary school? Because we have to grow into this knowledge and the sensitivity in a rather fraught informational landscape we're in right now. So how do you see that working for elementary and high school students, both domestic and international?
You know, one of the things that when I talk about an African American critical geography, when you think about it, we should have had this a long time ago because so much of the experience of African Americans is embedded in the landscape. And because literacy is withheld, we don't have the luxury of having all of the books and things. And so the Tubman landscape was one of the places where I began to really develop my sort of landscape theory. And that when you think about how African Americans are interacting with the land, particularly on the Underground Railroad and escape, that this is a way for elementary school students to learn geography, to learn math, to learn orientation about astronomy. When you think about all of the different components, this is how, when I talk about using African American history in a fuller and a richer way, this is one of the things that I'm talking about. And so when you get to the high school level and college level, and even now, I'm working with another government agency to look at how do we map many of these African American experiences, because what I'm finding is that even we are woefully lacking in maps that actually help us understand our world and our geography. So there are really opportunities across the board to understand this critical geography in a new way, and the landscape of the Eastern Shore is a great laboratory to begin to talk about it. When you look at Tubman's escapes, you know that Siebert, if you know who Siebert is, he mapped the Underground Railroad. He doesn't accurately map much of the African American involvement in the Underground Railroad, and what we find is that map makers do not necessarily think about some of these episodes to use for cartographic information. So we have a lot to learn.
I'd like to say that traveling with, it was last summer, my grandchildren, Amari and Amira, ages 10 and 7, they were captivated by the fact that there was this inseparable connection, these inseparable ties between the people and the land on the Eastern Shore. And I think, just as I said, with the African Americans who in North Carolina were in fact marking these trees, it makes us think, and it made me think, what are the ways we can find the markings that were left by Harriet Tubman on her cultural landscape? What is this vital fluid that just as it flowed through the trees and they were getting it for a sap, what is this vital fluid that we feel it's palpable when you're on the Eastern Shore? Yeah. Not just adults, children feel it. So I think that there's a vitality and an energy that's so important. And as they help me understand, humans are always transforming the landscape. They're always transforming their environment, whether it's building new houses, people, or even, as my granddaughter was always reminding us, the rainforest issue. But I think that when we understand how this collection of landforms so powerfully resonates from people who visit there, it is just a very moving experience. And in particular, I'm so glad that the architects and those responsible allowed it, as we were moving into evening, to allow just everything in that landscape to speak to you. And they were understanding and looking at the stars and seeing how all of this, it's a way of studying the environment and appreciating the environment in a park setting. And they've done such a masterful job. And it's wonderful. I hope everyone will take the time to visit it.
Thank you. Sir, I saw you first.
Good evening, everybody. I want to thank the panelists. This is great information so far. And I'm just curious we've talked about critical geography and we've talked about trees and land. I'm wondering about water. And so the role of maybe rivers, streams, those kinds of aspects of the landscape and what role they play in the Underground Railroad, one, and then for Harriet Tubman as well.
I'm sorry, sir. Can you just mention your name since we're going to be on C-SPAN?
I'm sorry. My name is Reggie Chappell. I'm with the National Park Service. I'm the chief of the Office of Partnerships and Philanthropy.
Thank you. You want to take that, Cheryl?
Sure.
I want to defer to you.
I can start. I'm sure Marcy, you all probably have something to say because, I mean, Dorchester, and we're talking about the Eastern Shore. We're talking about the Chesapeake Bay. We're talking about the Choptank. We're talking about rivers. Remember that you cannot, except for a small strip between Maryland and Pennsylvania, you have to cross a major body of water to get out of slavery. Whether it's the Ohio, whatever, there's going to be a river. For Tubman, because she worked on the waterways for so much of her life, she had an intimate relationship with water. She understood it. It's much faster, trust me, to travel by water than on foot. And so a lot of these trips that she's taking, the waterway is involved. I've been on the waterway tour with our great friend John Crichton, who is passed now. And I've been on the Combahee River tour in South Carolina. Tubman had a very deep and important understanding with the water. And so there's a book called Blackjacks. And in that, he spends a lot of time talking about the relationship to water. And I'm sure my fellow panelists, they have even more to say. There's so much to say on that topic. It's a subject unto itself.
Sure is. And when you look at that video, the travel video, you see how much the water plays into the travel experience along the Chesapeake and up the rivers. And again, to get out on the water and to see the land from the water is a completely different perspective than experiencing the water from the land. And for me personally, that represents changing perspectives dramatically, because when you do that, you change the way you understand things. It's like we've all been taught that American history starts when the colonists got here. And if you flip that on its head and you look from the west to the east, it's a very, very different story than when you look from our eastern part of the United States to the west. So I urge you, when you come and visit, because I know you all will, to get out and take a kayak tour. Get on the Nathan of Dorchester that you saw there and get your narrative of what it was like to be on a skipjack during Tubman's time.
And I just want to add one more thing. You know, escaping with children, it's much more arduous on land if you can get them on. We have a escape out of Dorchester where a family of 6 leaves on Good Friday. And they have a head start because all of Easter weekend, of course, people are not paying attention. And, you know, it's not until Monday or Tuesday that people realize they're gone. They took a family of 6 out of slavery, and we're almost 100% positive that they went by boat.
Thank you. You have a question here to my left?
Yes, I'm Sharon Mitchell, and I'd like to thank the panel and the archives for having such a wonderful evening for us. My question is about continuing to understand Harriet Tubman's role as she moved out of Dorchester and, you know, southern Maryland up into Baltimore, which is where I'm from. And, you know, some years back, I met Dr. LaRoche when we were trying to look at Underground Railroad sites in Brooklyn, which really thought they had no part of the Underground Railroad, and that turned out to be quite contrary, thanks to Dr. LaRoche's approach to looking at things. In Baltimore, I was consulting with a church about a property they had acquired, and met with the congregants about what they'd like to see happen, and what I kept hearing was about their homes that were a part of the Underground Railroad, and this property was as well. And we hear stories, and we start to see, especially since I've read Dr. LaRoche's book, activity that has been non-documented in traditional terms of Harriet Tubman's activity in Baltimore. So I'm curious if you have a way to start helping that get integrated into the site down at the Eastern Shore. Like, how does she bring people up through the city and further north?
It's very important, and one of the persons in here, Dr. Betty Gardner, did a wonderful study on the impact of Baltimore. And there are a number of studies that help us understand that as a city that had a great deal of water and activity,
Yes.
and a large free African American community, there was this interface. One of the realities that public historians are constantly pushing against are the stipulations that in some ways are being imposed on sites for the Underground Railroad. For example, we worked on a site that an escaped individual said they had hidden in this cemetery, and it was documented in several other narratives. But unfortunately, it didn't meet the criteria of those who are certifying Underground Railroad sites. And I think there's going to be a tension, because there are many ways, as you're seeing and you're experiencing, there are many ways that people involve themselves with the Underground Railroad that may not meet this somewhat, for me as a public historian, artificial test.
Yes.
But the people know the history. The people leave the oral records, and there has to be a way of getting these stories in and then allowing these stories, like the story of my own family, this was about a year before Roots, to stand on its own. That there were 4 living relatives of this slave that were telling the history. Nowhere else, eventually I was able in the Virginia archives to certify some of it. But if none of it ever was corroborated, when will we let these stories stand on their own? And I know that that is touchy for the Park Service and other organizations that are stipulating and creating these, and they're very important ways of documenting and affirming. But people running away didn't leave a neon sign. They were breaking the law. Exactly. And so I think that as this new way of understanding and being sensitive to history, as history changes and is more embracing, I'm hoping that more of these homes and churches and other environments that African American, including cemeteries,
Oh, yes.
where people would hide during the day and then they ran at night. How in the world are we going to expand our sense of how this runaway story has to include more non-traditional sources and resources? The waterways, the lakes. We have to be able to look for footprints in some cases that don't exist, but we have to be tenacious enough to believe the stories of the people and build on those stories, not simply saying, these are the stipulations, you meet them. There have to be new ways of doing this.
You know, one of the things I really feel like I've pushed the envelope around some of the criteria. And so that critical geography and using the landscape,
Yes.
that's evidence if you look in a new way. I also have been pushing, successfully I would say, and talking about how to use oral history effectively. And I jokingly say everywhere I go, this is what I know about oral history. There's going to be something that's wrong. The fact is wrong, the name is wrong, you got the wrong date, there's something, it's going to be, as we say, jacked up. There's going to be something the matter with the history. However, the event actually happened. And so with history, if historians find one fallacy, they like to throw out the whole argument. If I find an oral history that's completely accurate, I know it's not what I want. I'm looking for that tension. So there are ways to use oral history responsibly, or not responsibly, that's not the right word, effectively.
Yes.
And that there are ways to use the landscape effectively and trace those oral stories and believe the people when they tell you. So there's a tendency to tacitly call people liars because we don't accept the history that they give us. And I'll say, because I see a number of young people here, if you're looking for a great, viable topic to study, Harriet Tubman in Baltimore is it. Because even if you look in Kate's book, she kind of glosses over Baltimore. And we know that she's operating as a base of strategy out of Baltimore. So anybody who needs a thesis or a dissertation or a senior seminar paper, Harriet Tubman in Baltimore is it.
And to add to that, with the churches in particular, if you look at who the congregation is composed of, the business owners and other things like that have these overlapping connections with fraternal orders. So you actually have a human bridge of organizational connection and genealogy, and even with Morgan, too, in the Methodist Church, that you have these overlapping, so you can make these contacts, even though they're very thin threads.
Yes.
They still kind of lay these human bridges that we can kind of build that. And we know that Douglas was in Baltimore, and that a lot of African Americans basically hid amongst the free population. And then, of course, would use the boats to go north. So we have documentary evidence on that. It's just finding these human bridges or these thin threads to build across. I'd like to work with you on that, so we can definitely talk, but I think that's
And I'd like to add one point. There are a number of scholars, particularly who I had oral history under Okan Uya, who had studied at Wisconsin and under the world's best historians. And Dr. Uya always said, people will write a lie, in many cases quicker than they'll tell a lie. Every written document is not correct either.
That's right.
So I ask people to give oral history as much respect as the written document and work to corroborate. But don't necessarily say they just don't know what they're talking about, because there's a lot of evidence, important evidence, that gets missed because people want, again, those sure stipulations and the, in a sense, easy way of researching. But I invite people, as you're doing, talk to people, go into communities, and understand those vital resources wherever they are. And new ways, obituaries. There are all kinds of records you can use that help you understand what you're hearing, but at least be sensitive and be open to listening.
And if I may just ask, is the Maryland Tourism Organization doing anything in that regard?
With Baltimore?
Yes.
Well, we have in the past, and we are going to really reinvigorate efforts all across the state, because I introduced our initiative as the Maryland Underground Railroad Initiative, because we have this opportunity to get stories told statewide. So we're going to head back out into the communities and reinvigorate our effort to get more stories told, because the more stories there are, the more stories there are to share. And I think that that's really important, because that's really what inspires people to travel. I know this sounds hokey, but we really want to keep the efforts moving forward to get these stories told, you know, in time for 2020, which is the release of the 20. So being a crass tourism marketer as I am, we want to use those opportunities to be in the media in a positive fashion to tie, you know, as one of those milestones. So,
Great. Thank you.
I'm happy to give you my card before you leave tonight, and I will certainly, you know, keep you posted if you want to get in touch with me, because we would love to have, you know, further conversations with
Wonderful.
anybody who's willing to come to the table.
Thank you.
Thank you for your patience, sir.
Ahmed Nuruddin, and very pleased to be here. As I listen to you talk about alternative sources, the president is a big manufacturer of alternative sources, so you want to be careful how you put that out there. I'm serious. As I hear you talk about the impact of the environment, and I listen to, ma'am, the tourism talk about flipping it on its head. To what extent is the experience of African Americans in slavery been kind of flipped on its head by the kind of environments that we keep people in? Where am I? If you look in most areas where the Underground Railroad took our people to, they're mostly urban. They're mostly still kind of ghetto. And it, I would submit to you, is intentional. Do you see the connection, if you will, to the need for a new Underground Railroad?
I'm not sure if that's pertinent to what we're talking about, but I understand what your intention is in terms of that history being reflected in the current situation and kind of making those connections. I would posit to you, actually, there is a discussion going on that the ban of immigrants, that there's actually going to be a new Underground Railroad for the immigrant population because of the fear of being deported. So there is a conversation, a buzz about that model being used in a contemporary situation for persons who are facing similar dilemmas by threat of deportation. As far as African Americans concerned, I would go to Cheryl's critical geography discussion on what happened with what they call root shock, African American communities being disrupted by World War II, with highways being driven right through communities and communities being totally destroyed, people being warehoused in public housing. So it wasn't intentional that those individuals who escaped enslavement moved into ghetto areas. That's not true. They moved into enclaves of familiarity that were rather African American. They were mixed communities of lawyers, doctors, dentists, and laborers. So our historic neighborhoods have never been, quote, ghetto. That really doesn't come into the late 1960s and 70s when you have the economic sucked out welfare increases. And so therefore there's an orchestrated effort to make that an impoverished area. So even in the midst of public housing, it wasn't a bad thing. People live with pride in those spaces. So, but when you have a situation that's pushing and pulling, and I would suggest you Mindy Full-Love's work on root shock, talking about Philadelphia in particular, the destruction of a neighborhood systematically creates an implosion on that community. And we're looking at that now. So now gentrification is doing the broom and making them pretty again. So there's a whole situation there, and I defer to you, Cheryl, to add to that.
Use the critical geography that I'm talking about and map any of these situations. Redlining, you can look at the introduction of the railroad, you can look at urban renewal, you can look at almost anything. When you map it, you begin to see that there is a chess game isn't the right way to put it, but that African Americans are shunted through the landscape, sequestered. Sometimes in black communities, there's only one way in and one way out. There's a lot of things going on in the landscape, and when you take that bird's eye view and look down, there are things that are still parallel to what you're talking about. And I agree with Dr. Jones that I just had a long conversation with a woman who is an immigrant, and there are parallels starting to take place around the Underground Railroad and people in modern day, and also for women. That women are struggling in particular ways, and they've had to resort to many of the same tactics. And so your question is, I think, a difficult one to answer, but well placed. And yes, I do see parallels.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your patience.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Hudgens, and I'm very happy to be here today. I just would like to thank the Lord, thank the panel, thank National Archives for this event. I'm just so happy to see this come to fruition. I love the nickname of Minty, and I'm just so happy to see this come to fruition. I just have some comments and maybe a question or two. I did participate. I went to the Harriet Tubman Museum in Eastern Shore some years ago, and I saw a flyer there. And at that particular time, they were advertising to come to Capitol Hill to talk with the congressman about the project here. So I did participate in that, and I really lost track and haven't really been keeping up with things, but recently I saw this particular flyer about this event tonight, so I'm just really happy happy to be here. And I would like to know, I got in a little bit late, when is the park opening in Eastern Shore, and what about the end of the national park, the other end of the project in New York? And I think I had another question, but I can't think of it right now.
Sure.
Thank you so much.
So the park opens March 11th, which is a Saturday, and there's lots of great programming on the 11th and 12th, all throughout the weekend. The park in Auburn has been authorized. It's going to be the Harriet Tubman National Park, National Historical Park, as opposed to the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Park, which is what we have in Maryland. And that is a much more recent development, and so I don't know yet when that will be open to the public per se, but on any given day, the church is open. You can see the gravesite. The museum in where her house was when she was a humanitarian, the visitor center, is open there now. And so I forgot, did you have another question?
That was it. Thank
Okay,
you.
great. Well, thank you. Oh, it was Harriet on the Hill. That was our initiative to get, or our project to get the park authorized in both Maryland and New York.
You were involved in that?
I sure was.
Okay.
I sure was.
And what is your name again? I'm sorry.
Marcy Ross.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much. God bless you.
So if time allows, we have 4 more questions. Lady
Okay, I'm Alicia Cohen. I'm from Loudoun County in Virginia, and we have several sites, Underground Railroad sites in Loudoun County. I was always interested because Frederick Douglass was from the Eastern Shore also, and in Easton and other locations, there are statues of him and all kinds of monuments and plaques. So I was wondering from the scholars if there was any relationship between Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass? Did they know each other? Were there estates, the plantations where they lived? Because I don't know the landscape that well there. I don't know how close they were.
We don't find documentation that they knew each other while they were on the Eastern Shore. But there is a newspaper article, and forgive me, I can't remember the date, where Frederick Douglass talks about housing Tubman when she comes through with some escapees in Rochester. So yes, they do know each other. There is this relationship, and she is relying on him to help her move her cargo, is one of those words, her passengers through the Underground Railroad. So yes, they do know one another. But it's not a relationship that is terribly public during the time. You see it in the newspaper article.
Okay.
I'd invite you to remember that Samuel Cornish, who founded the oldest African-American newspaper, was a missionary on the Eastern Shore for a time. So several newspapers have information about this Eastern Shore during this period of significance. I'd also ask you to remember that as these individuals are interacting with each other, they're breaking the law.
Yes.
So much of what they do in support of each other and working within the networks they create and expand, it's outside of the legal system. And until almost 1866, their citizenship is even in question. So they're not going to leave an extensive record. It's inferred in many documents. And I think the Maryland Hall of Records has a number of very good records that help us understand it. But I'd ask us to be a bit more patient and understanding that what they're doing had to be outside of the law, and they had to be extremely careful with everything that they did. And so even down to writing about it, even in later periods, it was very sensitive. And you can laugh, but when doing oral history with individuals who had, there were these children who had 29 brothers and sisters, the older group, there were 3 wives, the older ones, one of them escaped. And you can laugh, but the people I interviewed, they were sworn to secrecy because they believed they could go back. Now this is in the 1980s. They could go back and get the relatives of these children and re-enslave them. Oh. You cannot understand people who grew up in this era, that this belief about this system of enslavement was numbing. And even though we can be very sophisticated about it, these 4 children, who were the children of an enslaved man and several generations of enslaved people, believed in their hearts somehow that this system could still reach out and get them. So I think that we have to be sensitive to how real enslavement was for individuals. Goodness knows for Frederick Douglass and, of course, Harriet Tubman.
Okay. I just have one more question for Marcy related to tourism. And this is because I also work with the Journey Through Hollow Ground, which goes throughout 5 states on the western end of Virginia, Pennsylvania. And just like your system, there's economics around that. And so we're having people come to visit a site. And I guess my question is the visitors group and the Chamber of Commerce working with African American businesses to take advantage of the increase in economy, the money that comes in? Because the Visitors Center and most of the Chamber of Commerce's, they look at these sites to generate an increase in economic standing in the area. And so as a visitor, I always look at Is there someplace, can I shop? Are my dollars going to turn over several times? And unfortunately, when I go places that, as in Easton, I don't think I ever found an African-American business in Easton, but I'm standing right in front of Frederick Douglass, in front of the courthouse. So I guess I'm asking, is there any component within the plans of this total tourism activity which would help small businesses in the area to benefit?
Absolutely.
Okay.
We, through the Certified Business Host Program, we're engaging all businesses as much as possible. And in fact, there's leadership in the city of Cambridge in particular from the African American community to help the state, which can sometimes be mistrusted as government, actually have entree into those communities and into those businesses, because sometimes the mistrust can outweigh the desire to advance or move on. So yes, we're working with African American businesses, we're working with all businesses, and in particular on the Midshore in Maryland, there is a private sector small business development center that has done extensive outreach under the auspices of the Opportunity to Grow Tourism Businesses to help amplify what it is that we're doing. Absolutely.
I'm going to ask for the next 3 questions to be asked in succession. I'm getting my time, so if we can just have you say your name, your question, and then we'll try to have the panelists make a suggestion of who will answer, so we can get everyone's question in. Sir?
Sure. So I'm Eric Pabereski. My question is, one of my personal heroes is Sojourner Truth, and my understanding is that she met Harriet Tubman once during the Civil War. My question is she mentioned at all in the Visitor Center in the way that Frederick Douglass seems to be? I know she's not a Marylander, but...
Okay, we're going to table that, and we're going to have your question. Yes.
Hi, I'm Emily Golden. I'm a freshman at the George Washington University. And with the president's seemingly limited knowledge on figures like Dr. King and Frederick Douglass, how does that impact the significance of elevating these stories? And what role can my generation kind of play in continuing to share those?
Thank you. And sir, your question?
Yeah, I'm Dr. John Willen. I'm affiliated as a volunteer with both the Smithsonian and the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. And I got involved in the TV show as a technical advisor, Mercy Street, and I know that on Underground, another TV show, if they have cast an actress to play Harriet Tubman for the next season. Have any of you been consulted? And if so, what do you think their take is going to be on Harriet Tubman? Because they sort of tend to over-dramatize the Underground Railroad in the first season. And there's also, I just signed up for the March 11th, there's a bus trip from Washington up to the Visitor Center, an all-day bus trip. So
Great.
I think they still have places available.
Great.
So we have questions. We have a question from a freshman student. We have a question about Sojourner Truth and, of course, how history's played out on the small screen. So would anyone like to take one of those questions or answer all 3, because time is...
Heritage tourism is an important part of what we are now doing in history, particularly in public history. So I think your question is very germane. We have to understand how history has to make sense and engage. And one of the things, again, traveling with 2 grandchildren, they love the fact that there are the junior ranger programs and there are coloring books. So there are ways to engage individuals. Again, because so much of it dealt with the waterways, you get that energy. I would also add that while we don't always like to be very supportive of popular culture taking historical questions, sometimes we need to be very glad because it at least gets it out to a wider audience. And so I think that even if it's not always totally correct, that at least it has people looking at these images and thinking about them. And even a person who was a journalism student who was finally won over to history, you can see how there is this possibility of taking something like journalism and how history just usurps it and moves it all forward.
Mr. Elcock, I saw you reaching for something.
I was going to say that I know we addressed Tubman in the Civil War and our contributions in the Civil War. To be honest, I don't quite recall how much of the Sojourner Truth piece is told at this point?
I don't think it's told at all in the visitor center because the Tubman and Underground Railroad story, because it's not just Tubman, it's lots of
Yeah.
Underground Railroad stories. But to me, that would be an inspiration for you to start a movement to figure out how we get that done, whether it's Maryland or anywhere else. And with regard to our leadership in the White House today, and at any time you find people who whatever. I say again, keep ever moving forward. Use the principles of Harriet Tubman that we heard so eloquently today to overcome that kind of obstacle and that kind of enslavement of words, and be inspired and use those. And what can young people do? Okay, so I'm a mother of a 25-year-old and a 24-year-old. Get out from behind your screens. Go to the places where these things actually happened, whether it's the Eastern Shore for the Underground Railroad, or it's the Grand Canyon to look over, because there's no place like being there, and you simply can't get the sense of all of this by sitting at your screens and keeping your noses and your heads in your screens. Get out and put your feet in those authentic places where the things actually happened.
But I'll take the opposite view and say, particularly for African Americans, when we're doing these things, the digital humanities is the hottest thing out there. And so if you're looking for a area of study, go into the digital humanities. We need you, because everything that we do now, we're relatively old. And so, we're not that great with technology. And so they're scanning documents, they're transcribing documents. You don't go to the archives. All of these archivists are trying to get you not to come. They don't want to see you. They don't want you to handle their stuff. They want you, they're scanning it. And so it's very important, because if you have the digital training or the IT training, but you don't have the history, you're not serviceable to us. And so we need you to have the historical piece, the geography piece, and the IT piece. That is really critical for the work that we're doing. And so I would invite you to marry those things, wed those things together, so that you could really be effective in the work that we all do.
Well, I want to thank the audience for staying with us through all the closed doors, and I want to thank our panelists.